Good morning.
Good
This
morning.
is Thoughtful Thursdays by Tornado IP, the place where innovation meets strategy and intellectual property. This is one of several Thoughtful Thursdays episodes where we will be focusing on how information is managed in a manufacturing private sector. And we will be interviewing a number of very interesting subject matter experts. If you are interested in learning more on this topic, please check out the Tornado IP Consulting website. You can also email us at info@tornadoipconsulting.com. We will be hosting some free seminars and some workshops on the best practices around information management in the time of AI. So today it's a pleasure to introduce my guest, Dr. Andy Kirk. She was Director of Information Management, where she retired from at the Dow Chemical Company, where she led organization whose sole purpose was to enable access to information relevant to knowledge across the whole chemical industry enterprise. In this capacity, she worked at the boundaries of information technology organization with the business and functional groups at Roman Haas and subsequently Dow. So she, in a way, was a translator between in information technology IT, which today is so relevant for AI, the subject matter experts in various different functions such as R&D, manufacturing, business. And so she's really a cross-functional translator, and I was really looking forward to this conversation. So in today's episode, we're going to talk about how companies keep proprietary knowledge from slipping away. And, this is not only a topic that became relevant in the age of AI. It's always been relevant. So I thought this is why it's a great way to set the stage with someone who has lived and breathed this type of question in her working life. And, we will try to pull in a little bit how then this leads to confidential information management in the age of AI. So welcome, Andy. And
Thank you.
I have a few questions for you, and we can chat and love to hear any of your thoughts that are related to this topic. What does it really mean to manage proprietary information well inside a company?
Well, I think if you're managing information well, then I would think that you could get to your own information, you could get into the information of whatever teams and groups that you're associated with and are working with, and then you can get to all the information that your company or your R&D organization or your manufacturing organization has been able to create, and you can get to it in hindsight, when you're looking to see whether something has been done before or answers have already been provided to whatever questions you're facing. So to me, if you're managing your information well, then the people in the organization have access to the historical and current information that their work requires, and their ability, and they also understand how to use it, and they also understand what their responsibility is to put the information they create into it. So it's a whole kind of an ecosystem, if you will.
How have industrial companies historically maintained and protected technical knowledge in your experience?
Well, I go back to the paper days, and in some senses that was easier to manage because it didn't proliferate quite as easily as information can proliferate in the electronic world. Historically, people would write reports. These reports would get filed. They would be held under lock and key if they contained what the company would have considered proprietary information, or information we've discovered that we don't necessarily want to share with others because we want to monetize it. Basically, we want to turn it into products. So the way people controlled it is usually there was a central information gathering group in the R&D organization. This would have been called the library. Their role was not only to provide access to external information that scientists and engineers need, but also to manage the internal information so that it was held tightly, but also accessible to to scientists to come back and look at again. As we approached the advent of technologies that could offer the ability to search and browse this information online, then there was a migration of all the historical information into online databases that scientists and engineers could access. And in doing this, you're hoping that you give access to the people who need it and keep the access away from people who don't need it and might be more likely to share it in ways that you don't want to share. Am I making sense?
Yeah, this kind of links to my next question, Andy. What must a company do? And I think one of the things that I really want to highlight here is one of the great benefits to having Andy here is that she has seen how the things that she's talking about was done in very, very different companies that merged together at different times. And so, this is also, she's been in a community of others, like people in similar roles in other large manufacturing companies. So, the things that she's discussing is pretty much best practices across different manufacturing industries. So, what must a company do to earn information into long-term competitive advantage is what is a related question here.
What the organization, well, what the leaders in the organization need to do is they need to prioritize that this activity for their scientists and engineers, the activity of making sure that the information that you create or you discover gets properly recorded and secured in the company's systems, then it starts with the leadership telling the scientists and the engineers that this is how we're going to manage your information. You're going to, you're going to upload your information. You're going to put it in these formats. You're going to add some metadata so we can find it better. And, the system will provide, some standard stuff. You need to provide the specific stuff that makes this research or this finding unique. But the problem is that when scientists and engineers are, taking care of their information management responsibilities, in their mind, they're not doing science. And so there's always this, tension between those that want to create robust and complete databases and the individuals that need to contribute to it, because putting my information into a system today, whether it's an AI system or information management system, more simple information management system, it doesn't benefit me today, right? It benefits somebody else today. And I might get benefit from somebody else's information, a year from now. So there's no instant gratification for contributing to these systems other than the leadership hopefully um, impressing upon them and providing the vision that having this to use as as the platform from which we do our research would be a real competitive advantage, because the information inside your organization doesn't get organized for you, like if I go to a Web of Science tool or a Derwent tool or some search tool that you pay lots of money to access. Somebody else created that pot of information for you. With your internal information, no one's going to do that for you. Your organization, the people in it, have to do it. So the leadership has to support it and have the vision of what it's going to deliver.
Yeah, I think this is a really, really interesting question that will link us to AI actually. But do
It's
you have
the
any
same
other?
problem. You've
Yeah,
got to train your AI system. Someone's got to sit
yeah,
there and do the boring part, And what we used to say, well, two comments, little adages that I had during my working life. One was, if the scientists that I was trying to participate, their attitude towards creating this research information database, their attitude was as if there was a quarter-inch speed bump. You've heard me say this, a quarter-inch speed bump between them and the grocery store. And if there was, they'd starve because it's too hard. Too hard to go over that speed. Too hard to put upload. I'll upload 5,000 pictures to Facebook, but I can't put my research report into the database, right? There's very little gratification for doing that in that moment. And the other thing that I used to tell the leaders is, in order to have this database available to us, sometimes you have to slow down a little bit so you can speed up later, right? So if I take some time out of my scientists' day, that they're not running experiments, but they're, putting their information into the system, that doesn't feel like it's helping them accomplish today's goals, because it's not. But it will help somebody hopefully, meet today's goals, sometime down in the future. And you can collect anecdotal evidence of this by talking to the users. I found something that was a failed thickener, and I was able to turn it into a very good paint, something like that. You can find things that were made and studied that weren't applicable at the time, but then all of a sudden you're starting, weeks or months down the line in a research project because you found something that someone had done 5 years before. That's the idea.
So I think you already touched on this a little bit, but maybe, and do you have any other thoughts on where companies most often fail in balancing collaboration and confidentiality?
Well, in the scientific world, and I'm not as familiar in engineering, but in the scientific world, there is a huge amount of information that's public knowledge that comes out, the science that comes out of public universities and government labs and things like that. And in industry, we would want to participate and benefit from that information, but we don't necessarily want to contribute our information to it because we want that information because it's a competitive advantage. And so there is this tension, especially for scientists that become um, known outside of the company because of their expertise of where that line is of what you can talk about your research and what you shouldn't because it's proprietary and could damage the company's business down the line. So, all I don't haven't worked at that many places, but all companies struggle with what that line is because it's really almost every person that's going to talk about their work has to create their own boundary of where the line is between what I can talk about to every scientist and what I can only talk about with the people that work in my company. But I think that aspect of it, there's a lot, I think, of what would be called tacit knowledge, the knowledge of the group, the people around you. I remember when I started working, I was afraid to open my mouth if I went to a scientific meeting. You sort of get your legs about you once you kind of see where that boundary is, once you've been working in that atmosphere for a while. And then the third area is, and I don't know how prevalent it is, but there's also trade secrets. There are aspects of research that the company decides that we're not even going to patent this information. We're going to keep it as a company secret. Because if I'm able to keep it as a company secret, then I can leverage that information monetarily for as long as it's a secret and as long as that product is useful. If I patent that information, I only have a certain time period through which I am given exclusive rights to monetize that information. And then after that time period's over, then it's open to everybody, right? That's how we have generic drugs. So there were times in the past where I've known, at least Dow and Roman Haas, that they had chosen to keep certain aspects of some products trade secrets, and then that makes everybody crazy because then they don't even want the information in broad-based databases because it could get out and competitors could leverage it, stuff like that.
Yeah, certainly. The more people know the information, the
What?
more likely it's. The more people know information, the more likely it's to be shared, either
Yeah,
intentionally or
because
unintentionally.
all it has to do is someone in the group that's listening to it doesn't have the same background and training as the other people, and then there are nefarious people that hack into or get into trouble. They get approached by people, I'm sure, and bribed to provide, and there are lots of ways you can leak it, but if you don't let the information flow freely within the organization, it's always this tension between locking it down so that we can keep our competitive advantage, which basically means can keep making money off of it for as long as possible, versus letting the information be more open and flow within the organization so that it can be leveraged for even more things. And, so it's this, tension between the two positions. And the lawyers want you to lock up everything forever.
Yes. So trying to pull us back a little bit to AI, everything you
Yes.
define now actually is very much relevant for AI too. And so any thoughts on AI and I think maybe the way to tie it in a little bit is what are the real limitations of AI when it doesn't have access to the full internal context of most of our big efficient companies?
Yes. Well, AI, at least from this perspective, needs a treasure trove of data and information in order for it to find the best connections, the best analogies, the best answers to whatever question you're trying to answer. The issue with that is as you get into more specialized areas of research, you need the AI tool needs to be trained. It needs to learn about the area that you're studying. And in order for you to train it, you have to be able to put information, hopefully as much of the existing knowledge on that topic into the database that the AI algorithm is going to look at to come to its decisions. And again, this is something that the scientists and engineers and technical people need to do themselves, because they are the only ones that know that information well enough to know which documents and which other information needs to all get put into the database so it can get analyzed and come to the best choice. And this is where you can run into trouble, where I would think if you don't put in a balanced view, you can tilt the your database one way or another. And again, this is a job that the scientists and engineers need to do, but they have their experiments to run, so they have to stop working at the bench and work, put information into a computer, which doesn't feel very much like R&D to them, even though in that case it might not. It might be more immediate gratification if they're building databases for themselves, for the research that they're doing. But I've seen jobs advertised recently for people who are subject matter experts, retirees that want to come back and train AI databases. So they're hiring people to do that, or some people.
Yeah, this is very, very interesting because I was just listening to a podcast on AI and how they were talking about how if you have a city where you have autonomous vehicles fully deployed, like San Francisco, and this works great, and you can hail an autonomous. You would think you could just move that system and plug it in the middle of Philadelphia or Boston, but that's not the case at all. You actually have to retrain the system. People in the background will have to take a look at camera recordings of some test cars and circle, oh, this is what a pedestrian looks like, this is what a traffic light looks like in Philadelphia. So you have to retrain every time. So I can imagine that even if a company were to have its own AI system that's internal and totally blocked off from the outside world, to do this kind of annotation on the scribbles of scientists sometimes, it's a huge task. And if you can't, I think to me, to learn traffic lights and pedestrians in a city is nothing in comparison. And if AI is not good enough to teach itself that, the scribbles of scientists, it's a bigger challenge. So,
well, one of the things I think that AI does that was a big deal frontier when I was still, when I was still in work. I was going to say it. I have no words. When I was still working, was that all the tools that you could buy, they either could look at structured data, numbers basically, is structured data, or data that comes in a particular file structure every single time. So their databases that could look at numbers and databases that could look at text. And as we all know, in anything we read, in the documents, in the books, in the journal articles, what we write, the text and the data are merged together, and you really want to search at them together. But there were no tools that could look at both kinds of structured text and unstructured text, structured data and unstructured data, basically text and data. But in AI, it seems to me that barrier's been broken, that you're looking across the whole document and it can search. It was just when I left the industry, we were just starting to be able to search graphics, the numbers, the dates, the data points, the legends. It could pick out the words that were on the graph, and then with those words give you a hit to your search terms containing those words. But it was a graph, it wasn't a paragraph, it wasn't an article. And that, as far as making it easier and making more sense to the user to be able to put this kind of information together, was like the holy grail. But I do think that AI, even to be able to do searches with just that as its new functionality, would be a big deal for people to use internally, because you could go to one place and then search across, structured data, either or, right? or.
Yeah, I think this is exactly where many of the most innovative companies are heading. A few questions for you that are kind of like lightning rounds.
Yeah.
Data, would you rather say data, information, or knowledge?
Or like what I'd rather have. Well, if
Which
I
one?
had,
How would you define it? How would you define it? Would you call something data? Would you call it information? Or would you call it knowledge?
well, I imagine if you're clever, you could get things that could different scenarios would serve could be one thing, and in a different scenario could be the next, right? Because if I was someone who worked on the early stages of the project and I just collected boiling points or something like that, that data doesn't go bad, right? But to somebody else down, that's not a very good example. To somebody else down the line, looking back at that boiling point data, that might provide them with information to go, to see which solvent is the right one for their reaction or something like that. So, I mean, it kind of depends on the context, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. That for data versus information, because to me data is what comes out of your instrumentation, what your measurement, it's a number and a unit, 37 degrees, that's it. It has no interpretation associated with it, no meaning. The information is when I start saying, okay, that's the boiling, I made that measurement on this liquid on this day. And then knowledge would be all liquids of this family all have these, and then you get wisdom, which is, how you measure that.
I like the way you started this thought, Andy. Like I think definitely in the context of a big R&D organization, data is sitting in all these pieces of equipment, and it's just sitting there. And once you have a way to access it, like put it into some kind of a central system for the scientists to access it, now you get to information because people can get to it and get informed. And then knowledge is when you take that information and do something with it, like put two and two together and say, oh, that piece of equipment with that kind of a setup can lead to an amazing thing that a customer might need.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's
So,
how it gets built on. Yeah,
yeah.
and
So, what are your
predictiveness.
thoughts? Do you think AI can replace institutional memory at some point?
See, I still go back to that the completeness of your database, the completeness of what your system holds is still based on the people that put it in. So I think it comes down to the commitment of the organization to to commit that it's a fundament it's a fundamental part of the way we do science these days. Is that it used to be just like you come out of graduate school in my day and you learn how to keep a scientific notebook that gets signed and witnessed so that it's usable in a court of law to defend your discovery in a patent. People have to get trained, how to do that. These days, even that process is done electronically. And you just have to, at some point, have the commitment of the organization that they're going to do it this way from now on. And then when the new people come on, that's just the way it's done. It's always the transit, what they, in change management, it's not the change, it's the transition, that people resist because they don't see the value. And some will, but those who don't need the leadership to say, okay, I'm sorry you don't see the value, but you're going to do it anyway.
Yeah, and I think this kind of gets to my last question for you was the one underestimated knowledge management challenge. Would you say this is the challenge to get people's buy-in, or is there something else that's more important, that's underestimated?
Well, I guess there's what comes to my mind. There's when I was working on this in the earlier 2000s. One of the barriers that we found is that people that are seen as subject matter experts within their organization, there are, and we all know have known them. People that just they kind of seem to be connected to a lot of other people. They themselves have a lot of institutional knowledge, and again it comes down to the person. If that person sees their knowledge as, it belongs to them, but it also belongs to the company and therefore it belongs to everybody who works for the company, so I will freely throw it into your databases and allow everyone to access it. That's one extreme. And another extreme is I've figured out all this stuff. Everyone comes to me. It makes me important. It makes me valuable to this company. And if I put everything I know into a database, then they don't need me anymore. And so there has always, again, another tension between people wanting to share, because if they share their knowledge, then you might become a personal competitor to them, and they're hesitant to do that, and they want to keep their position in the company as that expert in that area. So that's one barrier. The other is the initial creation of um, the database, because no one will take. You can always say yes. From today, we're all going to put it in the database. But what also makes it valuable is all the historical stuff that you can get your hands on. Inputting all that stuff is not a very fun job. So to me, those are getting the organization, especially the business side, to fully commit the resources and the time to get it done right the first time, and then add to it, because the adding to it and keeping it up to date is incremental compared to maybe not for some of the new startups and things like that, but a company like Dow that's been around for 100 years, there's there's a lot of information laying around that could be leveraged that isn't, probably, even now.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, thank you, Andy. This has been a really, really insightful, interesting conversation. I'm looking forward to some follow-ups.
Okay.